I started podcasting in 2015. It's been 9 years. It's crazy. I've done this so consistently that it's really opened up a lot of opportunities for me. Now, when I started, I didn't really know a lot about business. I didn't really know a lot about science communication or even marketing. But since I started, there are a lot more people who are getting into not only the podcasting space, but just science communication in general, whether it be on TikTok, whether it be on YouTube, whether it be on Instagram. It doesn't matter. Everybody is putting in their voice, and I love it. But when we talk about how we should do science communication, there's a little thing that we need to know about, and that's the marketing side and even the branding side. It's a word that I've been afraid of for a long time, but I want to talk about it today because I've had a number of conversations over this past week that's really made me think of branding and why it's so important when we talk about science communication. We're going to talk about that on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And this is a lot of fun. I love talking about science communication. Every Wednesday, this is what I post. I post something about science communication, whether it's about podcasting, whether it's about specific strategies that we can take, or whether it's about branding. It's a word that I've been afraid of for a long time because I never really knew what it meant. I've looked up definitions. I've followed YouTube videos on, how to brand your site or what your personal brand should be or what your business brand should be, how to go about it. And I never really got to me. It never really stuck. Maybe because it's a little bit more creative and I just didn't really understand it at the time because I have a very analytical brain sometimes. I'm a scientist. It's what I do. But it's something that I wish that I knew more of. And then over the last week, I've really been talking to some people and really understanding how important a brand is. And I do have a brand. I just never really call it a brand. And over the last week talking to a couple of people, I've really realized that, I do have a brand and that's how I communicate what I'm trying to do. And that's really what a brand is taking sort of your mission, your vision of what you want to do and what you've been doing and what made you do it, your why, and bringing it all together and putting it into some sort of content creation mechanism, whether it be a podcast, whether it be YouTube videos, whether it be TikTok videos, whether it be Instagram, whether it be Twitter Spaces. There are so many different platforms that you can publish content on. Now it's just a matter of how do you organize it? What's your purpose? Why do people want to listen to you? What are they coming for? And I think that's something that's really important. Last week, I was speaking to a friend of mine. I'm not going to name names on all the people that I'm talking about, but they're a friend of mine who's also an entrepreneur, who's also a marine scientist. And we were talking about, her product that she sells, her service that she sells. It's great service, great product. And, it was one of those things where we were just talking about how there are a lot of companies out there trying to do sustainability. Trying to make sure that the company is as sustainable as possible. And there are other companies who are just greenwashing, just taking advantage of the fact that people are getting more green, people are getting more eco-friendly. And that's obviously not right because, you're trying to put one over on people saying that you are a little bit more green when you're not. You're just using that as a marketing scheme, as a way you're saying, this is my brand. I'm all about, protecting the oceans or protecting the planet. Yet I'm continue to use, plastic cups, or you can use like unsustainable ways to do packaging and stuff, or you're not striving to do so. Look, I am not a person who says every company has to be perfect. But if you say you're going to try and do something, you have to try and do it. And we all make mistakes, and it's not an easy thing to do, especially these days. A conversation I had yesterday, which, by the way, on a Monday morning, when you have a meeting where you're walking along the water for about an hour, it's pretty spectacular. You're in a good place. But it made me realize, as have meetings with these people, I'm like, I am telling my brand. It was the first time yesterday I had a meeting. First time I ever met this person. We're meeting. She tells me a little bit about her business. I tell her a little bit about my business, and we see where we can jive in the future, right? And my business is podcasting, is media, is communications. I have my company is called Speak Up for Blue Media and Communications. The goal of that, and what I tell people is, look, I started this because not enough people that I knew about what was happening in the ocean. I wanted them to know about it. I went and I looked at the news, mainstream media, and you didn't get a lot of information on it, especially back when I started in 2015. Now there's a little bit more information, but I try and bring it all together and provide a resource through this podcast. And then also provide hope, because I have, when you have a brand, you have stories and you tell these stories. So the reason why I started the podcast, the story that I tell is, I started this podcast because people didn't know what was happening in the ocean. They didn't know about climate change. They were like, hey, this climate change, is it going to go away? Is it just a phase? They didn't have an idea. This is family. These are friends. And that got me frustrated. And I started to look around. I said, hey, wait a minute. There's not a lot of information out there for people, especially if that's not their primary interest. They're just wondering. They're just asking me. So why don't I put out some content around that would help people understand what's happening with the ocean, get some news, get the information that I get. The information that I get, like at conferences from other people that talking about their projects or talking about what somebody else is doing, and how exciting that is. How when we leave the conference, we're like, man, there's so many cool projects that are happening and people don't even know about it. Well, now they do, based on what I'm saying. And it's not everything, and I can't be perfect, but that's my story. That's how I started, and then over time I started to realize that it wasn't just enough to make people aware, right? But it was also to get people to have hope, to inspire people to change their behaviors. And the story that I have for that, another story, which is part of my brand, which I didn't even realize, was I remember I was sitting at a dinner. We were going out with my CrossFit gym, right? We're a community, we're a cult, whatever you want to call it. And the owner of the gym said, hey, you know what? I've been watching your videos, but I had to turn them off. I had to stop watching because they were so depressing. And I was like, oh, interesting. I didn't realize, that what I was putting in on the internet was depressing. And so I went back and I looked and I talked a lot of the problems that we're facing in the ocean, but not a lot of the projects that we're helping, helping communities, helping people sort of deal with the consequences or adapt to the consequences of, say, things like climate change, plastic pollution, overfishing, and so forth, right? And that's where How to Protect the Ocean, the idea of How to Protect the Ocean podcast kind of came about. It went from just telling ocean news and making people aware to talking about how to speak up for the ocean and to talk about what to do to live for a better ocean. I say it in every podcast that I do. That's my brand. These are the stories that I tell people that help me get to where I am with my brand. And my brand will change over time. It'll be something, it will never be static, because it all depends on how my audience is giving me feedback, what feedback I'm getting from the audience. It's always going to depend on how I see things shifting, how the climate of science communication is shifting, where the focus needs to be. If there are other people who are doing better than what I'm doing now, I might have to change. It's always fluid. It's always changing, right? You never know which way the wind will blow and which way the currents will go. And I think that's something that is important when you talk about a brand. But I think we always get, and including myself, I always get wrapped up in, you try and build a business and you're trying to build something that's important, but you don't really understand what you're supposed to do. What is a brand? What's a business plan? Why do I have to do all this stuff? And sometimes you don't have to do it. Sometimes you just have to put it together. You just have to put these stories together to tell why you are doing what you are doing. Why are you creating content? What's the purpose? And the reason why you want to have that is not to tell other people, but it's continuing to remind yourself why you're doing this. I've had to do that a number of times, right? Every time I do an episode, every time I plan out an episode, I say, will this benefit my audience? Is this providing value for my audience? Now, 9 years ago, if I said that if I thought that I was going to do an episode on branding, where that's the main topic, I probably would have laughed myself. I'm like, what are you talking about branding for? You don't even know what branding is. And here I am talking about on an episode talking about how I don't know what branding is and why I've been doing branding this whole time. I'm not perfect, but I tell stories to tell people why I'm doing what I'm doing. And that brings people in. That's sort of how people start to understand what I'm doing and get interested in why I'm doing this, right? And I think that's important for content creators to understand. What are you going to be talking about? Have a bit of a plan that's adaptable, that can change, so that people can understand where you're coming from. People can understand what you're doing. You can say it every episode, right? You can say it every other episode. You don't even have to say it at all. You can just tell stories, and every once in a while mention it in an episode. I used to talk about it every episode. It was in my intro. And then I started to be like, oh, I'm done talking about it now. I could just mention it, sparingly through my podcast. And every once in a while, I'm like, am I saying it too much? Because I know I have a lot of return listeners, but I also get some new listeners. I get people who, have messaged me like, hey, I've been listening to your podcast for the last few weeks, or I just listened to your podcast or so forth. And they contact me. They DM me at How to Protect the Ocean. It's really great. I love getting DMs about the podcast. And they're like, I've been listening to you for this long, for 6 months, for a year, for over a year. I've been listening since the beginning. It's always great to get the perspective of new users, of new listeners, right? It builds my audience. I may lose a few audience members over that time, but it builds my audience, and it also gives me a perspective, like somebody new coming in. How are they going to know what this podcast is about? How? It's why I say it every episode. This is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. That is my brand. Every single episode I say it. Now, there are certain people who have been listening to this podcast for a long time who will fast forward through that. There's those 15-second fast forward buttons, 30-second fast forward buttons, right? And I see that. And I think that's why at one point I stopped doing it, because I was worried, people are annoyed by it, so they're just going to fast forward through it. But for the new audience members, the people who just happen to come across my podcast, looking up how to protect the ocean, or what can I do to save the ocean, or however they find me, that's who the branding's for. It's to grow. It's to, if I get a new reach, if I reach a new audience member and they come back and they say, oh yeah, I could, that's really important. I want to hear what he has to say. And this is what he's about. So I know exactly what he's about within the first, minute and a half of the podcast. I probably have to do it sooner, but I like doing a little pre-intro beforehand to get people interested in what the podcast is about. So the whole point of this episode is really just don't be afraid of the business side and the marketing side of the internet. You have to tell people what you do. And you may define it as branding. You may define it as, just sort of like a vision or a mission, as we all know it in the science world. When we talk about nonprofit organizations, we talk about the missions and visions of that organization. But really, it's just a matter of just tell people what they need to hear. Tell people what you're doing and why you're doing it. They know how, they see it. Just tell people what you're doing and why you're doing it. It's really important to give that information to the next person. And I think it's something that people need to know. Then they can come back. That's where you get the loyal followers. That's where you get the super fans, or getting towards that. They become fans and an audience member, a regular audience member. So if you're new here, I know this is kind of sounding weird and it may be all over the place, but this is something that's important to me as somebody who does science communication, and as somebody who teaches science communication, someone who helps other people do science communication. If you're a marine biologist, or somebody in marine conservation, or even wildlife conservation, and you want to know more about marine, like science communication in general, and using digital media and digital platforms to do that science communication, just hit me up and you want to find out more and you want some help, just hit me up on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. That's at How to Protect the Ocean. The link's in the show notes. I'd love to chat with you about what your strategy is, what you're trying to do, try and get your branding and maybe flush it out a little bit. You want that 30-second elevator pitch if you can. But I think it's something that's really important. I think it's something that we need to do for effective science communication and effective conservation awareness messaging. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'm throwing this up on YouTube as well because why not? Right? Let's start getting on all these different platforms. It's something I've been wanting to do for a while. So if you want to check it out on YouTube, you can as well. I want to thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Have a great day. I'll talk to you later, and happy conservation.